Now, I go back. In my classes on government and politics, I tell my students governments have no souls. They have only their interests in mind. The common humanity of people, not the power of governments, is the only real protector of human rights. So I ask you, what is your duty as an individual? Karski was among very, very few who were bearing witness to what was happening in the world at his time, and a man who embraced that duty, that responsibility to report it to the world. So what we are living in at the moment would appear to be a time of infinite communication. And out of that, perhaps a coalescing of the information to achieve a desired response. Back then, very few people were reporting on what was happening to the Jews in Europe during the war. I first learned about Karski when I saw the Claude Lanzmann documentary Shoah. And I walked around in a fog. I was stunned. And Karski for me was the centerpiece of this incredible documentary about the Jewish tragedy of World War II. It wasn't until years later that, by some kind of fate, that Derek Goldman, who is the chairman of the Department of Theater at Georgetown University, where Karski taught, and also the co-founder of the Laboratory on Global Politics and Performance, whom you will be speaking with. He was tasked with presenting a centennial celebration of Karski at the university. And he asked me, would I like to participate?
I mean, I think one way of thinking about the work of the lab is as an antidote to the idea of isolationism of all kinds, cultural isolationism, political isolationism, and even as an antidote to a kind of exceptionalism. The sort of deepest current of what we do, I feel like, is to bring people together in understanding and in empathy, who often might not have the opportunity to encounter one another. That's something I think theater and performance does particularly well. So to be able to, in Washington, whether we're dealing with issues around racial justice and the legacy of slavery, which has a particular resonance and particular history at Georgetown, or whether we're dealing with migration and displacement or climate issues. I think the work of the lab basically is trying to take culture and the arts out of a solely kind of rarefied lane of this belongs only in a kind of high culture limited audience who can afford it, recreational space, and to really look at the significance of artists as at the center of the urgent dialogues and conversations about hard and critical issues.
Our mission is humanizing global politics through the power of performance. My aim is to try, in a way, to disrupt the traditional teaching of international affairs, which tends to be kind of long-term goals, security focus. What are the goals of our country? How do we achieve that? Not particularly looking right or left along the way, not paying, in my view, sufficient attention to the impact on people along the way.
In 2014, Georgetown was celebrating the centennial year of Jan Karski, the extraordinary Polish Holocaust witness and, courier spy, who had spent the better half of his life, the second half of his life as a professor at Georgetown. I was approached about, I had a long history of working on Holocaust-related and genocide-related material through performance, and was approached to develop a theatrical project connected to the celebration of that centennial. I was familiar with the outlines of Karski's story, but it was only then that I really dug in more deeply to the extraordinary contours of Karski's story. In choosing or in reaching out to David Strathairn, I just, having known and worked with David, had an immediate hunch that at the core of Karski's character is a kind of deep humility and elegance, and a kind of unimpeachable sort of moral strength and dignity. And that made me think of David right away, particularly the humility and the depth of the humility. I think an actor with flash and flair and self-interest would struggle to inhabit Karski. That hunch proved truer than I ever thought it would. And I think one of the, amazing things for us about this project has been so many people for whom Karski was an inspiration are still around our community at Georgetown. He passed away in 2000. Many of his former students have been part of our process and who have and his colleagues and have connected with David. And I didn't know Karski. I only connected with him through the footage and through our research. But people immediately felt, as soon as they saw David in the role, many people said it was as if he'd come back from the dead.
Often people say actors are mimics. And yes, we develop skills to somehow inhabit a personality. But when I approached Karski, I threw all that to the wind, and I was most interested in the man himself. His biographical facts were available, but there was writings about him, all his speeches. But I was compelled to search for the man that gave of himself so deeply. And I listened to his voice. I watched as much as I could. I read the material, yes, to get information about all that he had gone through. But my primary window was releasing myself to the sound of his voice, the way he spoke about his experience. You pervade your soul with extraordinary amount of just visceral reaction. And that's where I started from. I started from what he made me feel. Because I believe that the arts, whether it be a painting or a symphony or a poem or a movie or a dancing, any form of creative arts is primarily an arrow to the viscera, an arrow to your gut. It's intended to give you an emotive experience that then can become transformed into ideas. Why has man always gone to the fireside? Why do we have these things, television and movies and plays and music and art and dance and things? Why have we created them for ourselves? Because I believe that is the lifeblood of any community who wants to re-examine itself, celebrate itself, indict itself, explore. And Karski, for me, the insignificant man that he calls himself, witnessed, explored, shared, and taught on a very deep, visceral level. When you see him speaking, it's clean, it's pristine, it's clear, very chosen sentences, and yet inside, what I always feel when I listen to him is his deep, abiding, emotional engine that's inside. For me, what Karski did was he got to my heart first, and I think that's the bullseye that every theatrical cultural event is intended to do, is to get to the heart. When the war came to its end, I learned that the governments, the leaders, the scholars, the writers, said they did not know what was happening to the Jews, that the murder of 6 million Jews was a secret. They knew. Public opinion knew at the time. Governments knew. Intellectuals knew. Even if some didn't know, it was only because they didn't want to know. The Jewish problem was insignificant. The Jews were left alone to perish. My faith tells me that the second original sin has been committed by humanity through commission or omission, or self-imposed ignorance, or self-interest, or hypocrisy, or heartless rationalization, or outright denial. This sin will haunt humanity to the end of time. It haunts me now, and I want it to be so. When I left the White House on that day, 1943, President Roosevelt was still smiling and fresh. I felt fatigued, but it was, however, not an ordinary fatigue, but rather the satisfied weariness of the workman who has just completed his job with the last blow of his hammer, or the artist who signs his name under the completed picture. Something was coming to an end, and all that was left was this weariness. I sat on a bench in Lafayette Square, and I watched the people go by. They all looked well-dressed and healthy and complacent. They didn't seem affected by the war. Events passed through my mind in quick, strange fragments. The ghetto, the death camp, memories bringing nausea, the whispered words, "Remember this."